The living room looked staged, not decorated, arranged. The couch cushions were squared. The coffee table was cleared except for a single folder placed neatly in the center, like evidence waiting to be presented. My parents sat opposite me, side by side, their postures stiff and coordinated. It felt less like a visit and more like an intervention I hadn't agreed to attend. My mother spoke first. "We need to talk about what you did." I blinked. What I did? My father didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, hands clasped, as if he'd already rehearsed his disappointment. "You know exactly what this is about," my mother said. I didn't. But I could tell from her tone that the answer didn't matter. They hadn't invited me here to ask questions. They had invited me to receive a conclusion. "I don't," I said carefully. "So maybe you should tell me?" My father finally turned toward me. His expression was calm, certain, the kind of certainty that doesn't come from facts, but from repetition. "You've embarrassed this family," he said. "People are talking." There it was. People. Not names, not sources, just a faceless crowd whose opinions apparently outweighed my reality. "Talking about what?" I asked. My mother sighed, impatient. "Don't play innocent. We've heard enough." "Heard what?" I pressed. She gestured vaguely. "Stories. Things you said. Things you did." "That's not an answer," I said. Her jaw tightened. "Your denial isn't helping." I felt a chill move through my chest. "I'm denying it because it's not true," I said. "You haven't even told me what you're accusing me of." My father leaned forward. That defensiveness says a lot. I stared at him. "Defensiveness? You're accusing me of something without explaining it." "That's exactly what someone guilty would say," my mother snapped. And just like that, the trap closed. I saw it clearly then. The logic twisted so tightly there was no way out. If I denied it, I was guilty. If I argued, I was guilty. If I stayed calm, I was calculating. If I showed emotion, I was unstable. There was no version of this conversation where I was allowed to be innocent. "I didn't do anything," I said slowly. "And if there's proof, show it to me." My father shook his head. "We don't need proof." That sentence landed heavier than any accusation. "You don't need proof?" I repeated. "We trust what we've been told," my mother said. "Multiple people wouldn't lie." "Who?" I asked. She waved her hand again. "That's not the point." "It is the point," I said. "Because rumors aren't facts." Her eyes hardened. "Stop trying to twist this." "I'm not twisting anything," I said. "I'm asking for specifics." My father stood up. "You've already damaged our reputation," he said. "Now you're making this worse by refusing to take responsibility." "For what?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "For ruining the family image," my mother said. "Do you have any idea how this makes us look?" That was the moment I understood. This wasn't about a mistake. This wasn't even about something I allegedly did. It was about how they looked. Someone had said something. Somewhere. And instead of questioning it, instead of defending me, they had decided it was easier to accept the story than risk confrontation. Easier to blame me than admit uncertainty. Easier to sacrifice one child than destabilize the image they worked so hard to maintain. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. "I didn't do what you're accusing me of." My mother crossed her arms. "Your refusal to admit it only confirms our fears." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. "So no matter what I say, I'm guilty," I said. My father didn't deny it. "We just want this to stop," he said. "We want the rumors to die down." "And blaming me helps with that?" I asked. My mother met my eyes. "It's already done." The finality in her voice told me everything I needed to know. They weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for quiet, and they had decided I was the cost. I stood up slowly, my legs shaking, not from fear but from clarity. "You didn't confront me because you believed I was guilty," I said. "You confronted me because it was convenient." My father looked away. My mother said nothing. As I walked toward the door, I realized something else. Something colder, sharper. They weren't angry at me for what I'd supposedly done. They were angry that my existence threatened the story they wanted to tell. And in that house, image mattered more than innocence. I didn't leave their house immediately. I stood in the entryway with my hand on the door, listening to the silence behind me stretch into something heavy and deliberate. No one called my name. No one followed. That, more than anything else, confirmed what had just happened. They were done with the conversation, satisfied. The drive home felt unreal, like I'd stepped out of a room where the rules of logic had been quietly rewritten and left to make sense of it on my own. Every few minutes, I replayed the same sentences in my head. Your denial isn't helping. That's exactly what someone guilty would say. We don't need proof. I had always believed arguments ended when someone presented facts. I was wrong. Arguments like that end when one side decides the truth is inconvenient. By the time I got home, my phone was already buzzing. A text from my mother. You need to think about how this reflects on all of us. Not are you okay? Not let's clear this up. Just image. Always image. I typed a response. Erased it. Typed another. Nothing felt right. Anything I said would be filtered through the same broken logic. Explanation as manipulation, denial as proof, silence as admission. So I put the phone face down and didn't respond. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling something shift internally, not a breakdown, but a recalibration. For years, I had believed my parents wanted honesty, accountability, growth. What they wanted was containment. I started thinking back to smaller moments I'd brushed off before. Conversations where my version of events had been corrected mid-sentence. Times I'd been urged to let things go when they became uncomfortable for others. How quickly my parents adopted outside opinions when they aligned with their fears. This wasn't new. It was just louder. The next day, a relative called. An aunt I barely spoke to anymore. I heard there's been some drama, she said cautiously. I closed my eyes. From who? She hesitated. Your parents. They're worried about you. Worried. That word carried weight when used strategically. What exactly did they say? I asked. She paused. They said you've been making choices that don't look good. Did they say what I did? I asked. No, she admitted, but they seemed convinced. That was how it spread. Not as a fact, not as a story, as certainty. I thanked her and hung up, my hands trembling. Not with fear, but with anger sharpened by clarity. My parents hadn't just confronted me. They had started managing the narrative before I'd even left the driveway. And the narrative didn't require details. It only required agreement. I checked my messages later that afternoon. Another text from my father this time. You could have handled that better. I stared at it, disbelief giving way to something cold and steady. Handled what? Being accused without evidence? Being told denial was guilt? Being blamed so the night could end neatly? I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my laptop and started documenting. Not because I planned to confront them again, but because I needed my own record. Dates, messages, exact phrases. Not for revenge, for grounding. When people rewrite reality confidently enough, you start questioning your own memory. I refused to let that happen. As I typed, something else became clear. They weren't actually interested in my silence. They wanted my participation, an apology, a concession, a quiet acceptance of guilt that would let them tell others, it's been handled. That was the missing piece. They didn't need me to be guilty. They needed me to agree. That night, my sibling finally texted. You didn't have to push so hard, the message read. They were just trying to protect the family. I read it twice, then once more. Protect the family. Not protect me, not protect the truth. Protect the image. I typed a single sentence back. I didn't push. I told the truth. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. No reply came. And in that silence, I felt something settle into place. I wasn't trapped because I lacked evidence. I was trapped because I was the only one refusing to lie. And once I understood that, the situation changed. Not outwardly, but fundamentally. I didn't need to prove anything to escape a system built to keep me contained. I just needed to stop participating. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in through small decisions. What I answered, what I ignored, what I no longer felt obligated to explain. I stopped responding to messages that carried accusations disguised as concern. I didn't correct relatives when they spoke vaguely about the situation. I noticed how often people spoke around facts, as if naming them would break something fragile. It wasn't fragile, it was hollow. A week later, my parents invited me back over. The message was neutral, controlled. "We should talk," calmly. I went. Not because I believed it would be fair, but because I wanted to hear how the story had evolved without my input. This time, the living room felt different. Less staged, more defensive. My mother sat stiffly, hands folded. My father paced before finally sitting down across from me. "We've been patient," he began. I said nothing. "We're willing to move forward," my mother added, "if you're honest." There it was again. The conditional forgiveness. Honest about what? I asked. My father sighed. "You know what people are saying." "No," I replied. "I know what you're saying. People haven't said anything to me." My mother's lips pressed together. "That's because you're not listening." "I'm listening," I said. "I'm just not agreeing." That seemed to irritate her more than anger ever could. "You're being stubborn," she snapped. "You always have been." I nodded slowly. "That's interesting. Because a week ago, I was defensive. Before that, I was confusing. Now I'm stubborn." They both went quiet. "Those aren't descriptions," I continued. "They're labels. And they change depending on how little I cooperate." My father leaned forward. "We're trying to help you." "By telling me denial equals guilt?" I asked. "By repeating rumors without sources?" My mother waved her hand. "You keep focusing on details." "Because details are how truth works," I said. She stood abruptly. "This is exactly why this won't go away. You refuse to take accountability." "For something I didn't do," I replied. My father raised his voice. "Then why are so many people uncomfortable?" I felt a strange calm settle over me. "Because you told them to be," I said. The room went still. "You didn't tell them facts," I continued. "You told them conclusions. You said you were concerned. You said you were disappointed. You let them fill in the blanks." My mother stared at me like I'd broken a rule. "We were protecting you." "No," I said gently. "You were protecting yourselves." Silence stretched. My father finally said, "So what do you want?" The question felt performative, like the answer was supposed to be repentance. "I want this to stop," I said. "And it won't stop if the only acceptable ending is me confessing to something that didn't happen." My mother shook her head. "Then you're choosing conflict." I stood up. "No," I said. "I'm choosing reality." My father looked tired now. "If you walk away from this, don't expect people to forget." "I'm not asking them to forget," I replied. "I'm asking you to stop using me to clean up a story you don't want to correct." They didn't answer. That told me everything. On the drive home, my phone buzzed again. Another relative. Another careful voice. Another version of the same question. "Is everything okay?" I answered the same way each time. Yes, I didn't do what's being implied. Some people sounded relieved. Others sounded disappointed. A few sounded skeptical. None of that changed the truth. What changed was my role in maintaining the lie. I stopped attending gatherings where I felt like an exhibit. I stopped preemptively explaining myself. I stopped chasing clarity from people who benefited from ambiguity. And something else happened. Something subtle but important. Without my reactions to feed on, the story lost momentum. People stopped asking. Whispers thinned. New distractions replaced old discomforts. The rumor didn't disappear. It just stopped being useful. That was when I understood the final layer of the trap. They hadn't expected me to fight. They had expected me to fold. To apologize vaguely, to accept shared blame, to carry a stain quietly so the family image could be restored without examination. By refusing to do that, I hadn't escalated anything. I'd removed the leverage. The cost of that choice was distance. The benefit was integrity. And for the first time since the confrontation, I slept without replaying the conversation in my head. Not because it was resolved, but because I finally understood the rules and chose not to play. Distance changed the tone of everything. Without my presence to absorb the tension, my parents had to sit with it themselves. And they didn't like that. At first, they tried subtlety. Invitations that sounded casual but carried expectation. "We're having dinner if you want to stop by." Messages that implied generosity rather than accountability. "We're still your parents." I didn't respond. Not out of spite, but because I had nothing left to clarify. When people build a version of you that depends on your silence, speaking doesn't dismantle it. It reinforces it. A month passed before the next escalation. My mother showed up at my door, unannounced. She stood on the threshold like a woman arriving to restore order, purse clutched tightly, mouth already set in disappointment. "This has gone far enough," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I didn't offer her a seat. "You can't just disappear," she continued. "People are asking questions." "About what?" I asked. She exhaled sharply. "About you." There it was again. The same vague pressure, the same undefined accusation. "If you want this to stop," she said, lowering her voice, "you need to be willing to take some responsibility." "For what?" I asked calmly. She hesitated. "Just for a second." "For how things look." I nodded slowly. "So, still no facts?" Her eyes flashed. "Why are you being like this?" "Because you're asking me to lie," I replied, "and you're calling it maturity." She shook her head. "This family doesn't survive scandals." "This isn't a scandal," I said. "It's a rumor you refuse to correct." She looked away, jaw tight. "If we admit we were wrong, people will think we failed." That sentence hung between us. Not "we hurt you," not "we misjudged you." We failed. And suddenly everything made sense. "I'm not your shield," I said quietly. She looked at me, startled. "What?" "I'm not here to absorb consequences so you can look competent," I repeated. "I won't do that anymore." Her voice dropped. "So you're choosing this." I met her gaze. "You already did. I'm just not cooperating." She left soon after. No apology, no resolution, just frustration that the lever she'd always used no longer moved anything. In the weeks that followed, the story finally cracked. Not because I exposed it, but because it couldn't sustain itself without my compliance. A relative asked my parents directly what I'd done. They hesitated. Someone else asked for details. They deflected. Another asked for proof. They changed the subject, and slowly, quietly, people noticed the gaps. I heard about it secondhand. An aunt mentioning how confusing it all sounded. A cousin admitting the story never quite added up. A family friend saying, "It feels like something's missing." What was missing was the person willing to accept blame without resistance. My sibling reached out again during this time. "This is blowing up," the message read. "You could help calm things down." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I replied. It was calm when I was silent. It just wasn't true. They didn't answer, and I didn't follow up, because I finally understood something I'd been taught backwards my entire life. Keeping the peace is not the same as keeping the truth. One just requires compliance, the other requires courage. By stepping away, I hadn't destroyed the family image. I had simply stopped maintaining it, and without someone to carry the weight, it began to show cracks it had always had. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to be seen. The cracks didn't shatter the image overnight. They never do. What happened instead was something far more uncomfortable for my parents: ambiguity. Conversations where they could no longer lean on certainty. Questions they couldn't answer cleanly. Moments where their confidence faltered just enough for people to notice. And for the first time, that uncertainty wasn't mine to manage. I heard about it in fragments. A cousin mentioning that my parents seemed on edge. An aunt saying, I asked what really happened and they just said it was complicated. A family friend admitting quietly, it doesn't sound like you at all. None of them came to me for proof. They came because the story had lost its spine. Without my admission of guilt, without my apology, my shame, my cooperation, the narrative had nowhere to anchor itself. It floated. And floating stories make people nervous. My parents responded by tightening their grip. They stopped using my name directly and started referring to me as the situation. They framed their worry as exhaustion. They implied they were being generous by not saying more. But the effect was the opposite of what they wanted. People started asking why. Why was everything so vague? Why had I disappeared from gatherings? Why did every explanation circle back to image instead of facts? The pressure shifted, not onto me, but onto them. That's when my father called. His voice was lower than usual, controlled, calculated. You don't have to agree with us, he said, but you could help clarify things. I almost laughed. Clarify what? I asked. He hesitated. You know, the misunderstanding. There's no misunderstanding, I said. There's an accusation you can't support. Silence. You're putting us in a difficult position, he said finally. I took a breath. You put yourselves there when you chose rumors over your own child. His tone hardened. This is becoming embarrassing. There it was again. Embarrassment, not injustice, was still the problem they wanted solved. I won't fix that for you, I said. You're being unreasonable, he snapped. No, I replied calmly. I'm being consistent. That ended the call. After that, the invitations stopped completely. Not as punishment, but as strategy. If I wasn't present, I couldn't contradict the story. If I wasn't mentioned, the discomfort might fade. It didn't. Because silence doesn't erase questions, it multiplies them. I learned later that someone had asked my parents directly whether they had proof of what they'd implied. My mother had answered, "We trust our instincts." That answer landed exactly the way you'd expect, not as authority, as avoidance. The most telling moment came unexpectedly, through someone I hadn't thought about in years. A former family friend who reached out privately. I don't know what's going on, she said, but I want you to know something. When people tell stories without details, it's usually because the details don't help them. I sat with that for a long time, because she was right. Details hadn't helped them. Facts hadn't helped them. Only my silence had. And now that it was gone, they were left with nothing but implication. And implication doesn't survive scrutiny. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. For the first time, my sense of self wasn't being negotiated in someone else's living room. My integrity wasn't contingent on approval. My worth wasn't measured by how well I absorbed discomfort for others. The family image they were so desperate to protect wasn't fragile because of me. It was fragile because it required someone to lie. And I was done being that person. What finally shifted wasn't a confrontation. It was exposure, but not the kind people imagine. No screenshots, no public statements, no dramatic revelation. Just one quiet moment where the truth slipped out because someone else refused to keep pretending. It happened at a family gathering I didn't attend. I only know because my sibling told me afterward. Carefully, like they were choosing words that wouldn't implicate them. An older relative had asked a simple question. What exactly did they do? Not what happened, not what was said. What did they do? My parents hesitated. They gave the same answers they always had. Vague, emotional, circular. She caused problems. She embarrassed us. She handled it badly. The relative didn't interrupt, didn't argue. They just waited, and then said, "That's not an action." Silence followed. Apparently my mother tried to pivot, talked about tone, attitude, denial. The relative shook their head. "Those are reactions," they said. I asked what they actually did. There was no answer, because there never had been one. That moment didn't clear my name in some grand way. No one stood up and declared me innocent. No apologies were issued. No damage was reversed. But something more important happened. The certainty cracked. Not for everyone, but enough. After that, the language changed. People stopped saying, "I heard you did something." They started saying, "I don't really understand what happened." That difference mattered, because confusion invites questions. And questions are dangerous to stories built on implication. My parents noticed the shift immediately. They became quieter, more controlled, less willing to bring the topic up at all. The confidence they'd once carried like armor softened into something defensive. They stopped calling me the problem. They stopped calling me at all. At first, that silence felt like punishment. Then it felt like peace. I realized how much of my life had been spent bracing for conversations that never came, preparing explanations for accusations I hadn't earned. Without that pressure, my days felt longer, my thoughts clearer. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for understanding, not for approval, not for vindication. My sibling tried once more to bridge the gap. "They're having a hard time," they said. "They feel like you abandoned the family." I didn't respond right away. Then I said, "They abandoned the truth. I just stopped pretending that was normal." That ended the conversation. The truth is, people who rely on image don't collapse when it's questioned. They retreat. They shrink the circle. They control access. They remove variables they can't manage. I had become that variable. And instead of fighting to be let back in, I stepped further away. I stopped attending events where my presence would be interpreted as compliance. I stopped sharing details of my life that could be repurposed into narrative. I stopped offering emotional labor to people who saw it as a resource. What replaced it wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. I no longer felt the need to prove who I was to people who preferred who I wasn't. I stopped chasing fairness in a system designed to avoid it. One night, months later, my mother sent a short message. "We did what we thought was best." I read it once. Then I archived it. Because that sentence wasn't an explanation. It was a confession. They had made a choice. Not based on facts, not based on love, based on what preserved their comfort. And once I understood that, the last piece fell into place. This wasn't a misunderstanding to resolve. It was a dynamic to exit. I didn't need them to admit I was right. I needed them to no longer decide who I was. And that power, once taken back, doesn't require permission to keep. The ending didn't arrive with an apology. It arrived with absence. Weeks passed. Then months. Holidays came and went without invitations. Birthdays were acknowledged with short, polite messages. No warmth, no confrontation, no attempt to reopen what had been quietly sealed. At first, I wondered if they were waiting for me to reach out. Then I understood something clearer and more unsettling. They weren't waiting. They were adjusting. Without me. I heard about it indirectly. How conversations stopped when my name came up. How my parents referred to me less and less, as if removing the variable might stabilize the equation. How the family narrative slowly rewrote itself, not to accuse me anymore, but to erase the discomfort of unanswered questions. It was easier that way. No villain, no apology, just distance framed as privacy. And for the first time, that distance wasn't something I fought. It was something I accepted. I stopped wondering whether they'd ever admit the truth. Stopped imagining a future conversation where logic would finally matter. Stopped hoping for validation from people who had shown me exactly how conditional it was. I built a life where my name didn't need defending, where silence wasn't punishment, where clarity didn't require consensus, where love didn't hinge on obedience. One afternoon, I ran into a family friend at the grocery store. She hesitated when she saw me, then smiled carefully. "I hope you're doing well," she said. "I am," I replied, and meant it. She nodded, like she believed me. Then she added, "You know, sometimes families choose what's comfortable over what's true." I held her gaze. I know. That was the closest thing to closure I ever received. And it was enough. Because I finally understood this. They didn't confront me because they believed I was guilty. They confronted me because rumors gave them an excuse to preserve their image, an excuse to avoid uncertainty. An excuse to end the night quietly. They didn't need proof. They didn't want explanations. They just needed someone to carry the weight so they wouldn't have to. And they chose me. Not because I made a mistake, but because I refused to lie convincingly enough to protect them. Walking away didn't mean I lost my family. It meant I stopped being the cover story. And once you stop carrying a lie that was never yours, you don't collapse. You straighten. You move forward. And you finally learn the difference between being included and being used. The family image survived. I didn't. I grew beyond it. And that, in the end, was the only truth that mattered.